This is question 13 from section 1 of the 2014 BMAT, and in this question we're asked what conclusion can be drawn from the argument. So let's just remind ourselves, if we're looking for a conclusion that could be drawn, that's something that's not already said but does follow from the passage. So let's have a look at the passage. First, the writer says that crime figures produced by police aren't a good way to identify crime trends, and instead they correspond to police priorities. So if they're saying this is or isn't a good way to identify crime trends, it's probably, to some extent, their opinion will be based on the evidence they're about to give. And they kind of highlight what they mean by corresponding to police priorities, or illustrate it by giving examples. They say if there's an operation to tackle knife crime, then it will uncover more instances of knife crime, but that doesn't mean that knife crime is increasing. So they're saying that the amount of particular types of crime you measure doesn't tell you exactly how much that crime is going on, because it can also depend on what police are focusing on. So as an example, this is just a fact. And then the writer says police officers can be tempted to alter crime figures to meet targets. So since it's just saying something's possible, that's also a fact. They say police figures can be affected by inaccuracy, confusion and fraud, like all performance data. Again, it can be, so it's just saying what can possibly happen. And lastly, they say the crime survey, which asks people if they've been victims of crime, instead of asking the police how many crimes have been committed, is a more reliable source of data. So again, they're saying which methods are or aren't good methods, so this is their opinion. So, although these are opinion statements, it's not like one of those questions where you have to find the main conclusion. It would be one of these two. Whatever the conclusion is, it hasn't quite been said yet. However, these two opinions do kind of summarise what the writer's thinking. So they're basically saying the police crime figures aren't a good method and the crime survey is a better method, and then all the rest of these facts are just evidence that the crime figures aren't particularly good, the police crime figures. So if we want to summarise this, they're basically criticising the police crime figures. It could be due to changing priorities, fraud and other problems, and then they say the crime survey is better, and then something is meant to follow from this. So what's the obvious thing that it seems that the writer is arguing toward? Well, if they're saying the police crime figures have problems and the crime survey is better, then it looks like what they're saying is we should use the crime survey instead. You could think of this first line as laying out a problem, and then the conclusion might be their solution to the problem. So let's have a look at our options and see if any of them correspond to the idea of using the crime survey instead of police figures. Well, if we look at E says we should survey people's experience of crime, which is what the crime survey does, to see if it's increasing. Okay, so this is a bit more specific than what we can conclude. So it says it's to see if it's increasing. Actually, we could do this to, based on what they've said, maybe we should do this to check any other kind of trend in the data. But since this is just a more specific version of this, of what we were saying, it does also follow, so that looks like it's our conclusion. Let's just see why we can rule out the other options. So A says the police prioritise crimes that will help them meet their targets. Can we conclude that? Well, the writer does say police officers have targets, and they might be tempted to alter figures to meet them, but they don't say anything about other actions the police might take to help them meet their targets. And even if they did, they then need to show more evidence that police were actually doing that, as opposed to just being tempted. So this is stronger than the evidence we're giving. And then B says the police care more about targets than about fighting crime. Does this follow from what's been said? Well, the writer says that police care to some extent about targets, but they don't compare that to how much they care about fighting crime. They don't have any evidence about that. So B is also stronger than what we can conclude. And C says that much less crime occurs than is shown by the police figures. Does that follow from what's been said? Well, the writer says the police figures are likely to be inaccurate, but they could be showing more crime than actually occurs, or they could be showing less crime than actually occurs. And based on what they've said, we don't really know which it's going to be. So the example of tackling knife crime shows a case where the amount of crime that's recorded might increase, even though the amount of crimes that's happening hasn't increased. But that doesn't mean that police figures are always going to overstate the problem. So it says they're affected by inaccuracy and confusion, and either of those could alter them up or down, and we don't know how big an effect that is compared to the other effects they were saying there are on police figures. So we basically just don't know, based on this evidence, whether this is true. This goes beyond the evidence, it's too strong. And then if we look at D says that victims of crime worry that if they report it to the police, then criminals will retaliate. Is this something we can conclude? Well, nothing in the passage talks about why victims of crime do or don't report it, so this is just irrelevant to everything that's been said. It kind of looks like they wanted you to forget what kind of question this is and think this is a strengthens or weakens question, and then this might be relevant. But since it has to be something that follows from what's been said, it's just irrelevant. And so, again, we see that the answer is E.